thank you very much for joining us. My name is Eric. I'm our Chief Revenue Officer here at the Neo Exchange, now Acebo Global Markets Company. And welcome to a new segment hosted by the ETF Market Canada to talk to you about ETF Issuer Insights. Very pleased to be joined today by Andrew, VP and Client Portfolio Manager with Franklin Templeton Canada. Andrew, thank you very much for joining me.
Great, thanks for having me, Eric. It's a pleasure to be here. As part of the portfolio management team at Franklin Templeton Canada, I participate regularly in our research meetings and look after the client-facing aspects of what we do in running the ETF for investors. The Core Plus portfolio is designed to maximize diversification and yield enhancement. About 2/3 of the portfolio that we run is invested in Canadian instruments, and the remaining third or so would be non-Canadian, mostly US. And that gives us, we think, the right degree of diversification to help manage risk and the ability to pick up instruments, both of which are very important for fixed income investors. Well, Eric, the Canadian bond market in the global scheme of things is actually quite small. It's 4.4 trillion in size, and that's an adult number. But the US bond market is literally 10 times larger. And the global bond market in size, as at the end of December, is 192 trillion in size. So we're pretty small. It behooves us to want to look beyond Canada to avail ourselves of other kinds of instruments, other types of things that will help us diversify and fill the gaps and limitations in Canada. High yield bonds are a good example. High yield bonds don't trade very well in Canada, and there are not a lot of them to choose from. And the quality themselves can be questionable in some cases. Whereas if you look at the US, the high yield market there is so much more liquid, so much deeper and broader, and we draw regularly from the expertise of our colleagues in the US. So we have very specialized knowledge, and that helps to fill in a gap. US investment grade as well, and bank loans. They don't really exist in Canada necessarily, but they're basically high-risk issuers that have these loans out there that have very little interest rate risk or sensitivity. And there's a place for that in a fixed income portfolio, especially after last year, but they're usually issued by high-risk companies, so you have to do the work on the credit. So we put those pieces outside of Canada together with the Canadian component, and they fill those gaps very well, and they produce the desired diversification by design. There are some reasons for optimism. If we take a look back at what's already happened, you had 2 years in a row of total return losses in the Canadian bond market. That hasn't happened for decades. I think you have to go all the way back to the 1950s to find that. You've had one of the most aggressive and sustained tightening and interest rate hiking policies by the Fed and the Bank of Canada in history over the past year. And the US long bond, the 30-year bond, lost 25% of its value last year. The worst record for that instrument since its inception, going back to 1793, when the United States was an emerging market and issued government debt. So these are all what statisticians refer to as long tail events, very unusual and unlikely to be repeated by nature. Not impossible, not probable to be repeated, but certainly possible. So a lot of bad stuff has already happened. And I think that gives us context for why we can be optimistic looking forward. Second reason why we're optimistic is going to sound really perverse, but never, I think, in fixed income history has there been a more widely anticipated or welcome recession, especially here in Canada, probably the first housing-led recession that we've had going back to the 1990s. When people argue with me and they say, well, unemployment is low, how can you have recession with unemployment? My answer, Eric, is give it time. It takes time for an inverted yield curve, for example, to lead to a recession. The inverted yield curve happened here in Canada on November 22nd. When it costs you more to borrow in the short end than you can earn by lending in the long end, it's painful. And the longer that goes on, the tighter credit conditions become, and a recession is almost the inevitable result. And why that's positive, I mentioned it being perversely welcome, is that it's typically accompanied with interest rate cuts, loosening of monetary policy, and big gains potentially in bond prices. So that's the second reason why we're optimistic, is the onset of a recession would bring about the other side of this tightening cycle. Third reason that we're optimistic is we do a lot of work in corporate bonds. And corporate bonds had a really tough time last year. When you stop anyone on the street out there, they'll tell you they're paying more for groceries, more at the gas station, more for clothing. Everything costs more. But corporates have to live in that world too. They've got higher input costs, right? Higher transportation costs, higher labor costs, raw materials have gone higher, and their own costs of borrowing have gone higher. So those margins are under a lot of pressure, and corporate bond prices have reflected that, with spreads widening last year. As opportunists, as active managers, we're seeing ideas, we're seeing mismatches of pricing, and we're doing a lot of work on the fundamentals of which are those companies that have the ability to absorb those higher input costs, maybe pass on some of it in the form of higher prices to customers, but maintain their credit quality. And there are growing opportunities within the corporate bond investment grade segment that we're seeing and that we're actually quite excited about, but we have to be selective at the same time. So a lot of bad stuff's already happened. A recession is on the way. On the other side of it, it should be good news for bond investors. And corporate bonds are very interesting, but you've got to be selective. And that's where we think at Franklin Templeton that we've got an advantage as active researchers of corporate bonds.
Andrew, this has been a fascinating conversation, interesting content for our viewers. Thank you very much for sharing your issuer insights with us here at the ETF Market. Very pleased to have you with us today. Thank you for coming.
Thank you very much.